The untold story of horse racing in St. Louis. That's next on City Corner. Potter, welcome to City Corner. Nancy Carver has written the book Making Tracks, the untold story of horse racing in St. Louis, and she joins us now. Hi Nancy, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you for having me.
The untold story, it is an untold story.
It is. It's amazing how many people don't realize we even had one racetrack in St. Louis, let alone 18.
Yeah, you know, I'm from here and it wasn't on my radar at all. In the preface to your book, you quote a professional horse track announcer, I don't know who it was, but he said, why would someone who has never even been to a horse race, and he's referring to you, write a book about it?
Yes, that was actually when I went to my first race at Oaklawn, and I wrote about it because my great uncle, Cap Tillis, who donated Tillis Park in St. Louis, was one of the owners of several of the last racetracks in St. Louis, so I became very interested in it because of him.
Well, was this something you knew when you were young, or you discovered this when you became an adult, or?
I actually discovered it when I went to the library one day with my mother, and I saw a book that had obituaries in the New York Times. So I just skimmed through it to see if I saw a family name, and I saw Tillis. And then I found the article about my uncle owning racetracks, so I asked my family if this was true, and then I began to hear the story and thought it was quite interesting.
But obviously your family wasn't interested in that much. I mean, your parents, or maybe their parents even, right?
No, they weren't. Well, actually my grandmother went to the races quite a bit. She liked to bet on horses based on their names.
Oh, really? How'd that work for her?
It worked pretty well, actually.
Gee. Well, there's a lot to talk about here. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your uncle, but let's set the stage. Is it true, this is hard to believe, that at one time horse racing in St. Louis was more popular than baseball?
Yes, that is true. In 1890, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had an article that stated that baseball players were really worried that their income was going to be reduced because more people were going to the horse races than to baseball games. And in cities where they had both racetracks and ballparks, that was particularly true. And even when they had the World Series, more people went to the racetrack than to the World Series, if you can believe that.
Wow. So in your book, Making Tracks, you talk about the racetracks, not just in the city of St. Louis, but what we might call the metro area. So how prolific were they?
Well, there were 18 racetracks in St. Louis from 1767 to 1905. And during the end of that time period, there were actually 4 racetracks at one time because Missouri law changed and said you can only operate it 90 days out of the year. So to get around that, the partners owned several racetracks so they could go to one for 90 days, the next one for 90 days.
And now there's only one, of course, on the east side, Fairmont.
Yes.
Which has been around, I don't know, as long as I can remember, right? Is it one of the original ones?
1920s.
Is that right?
Yeah, so that was after the time period of my book.
There's a lot of interesting things to talk about we'll get into later, like, what happened to them and why they aren't here anymore. But talk about your uncle a little bit and what he was involved in and the people that he was involved with.
Well, my uncle was part of a racing triumvirate, and as I said, he is the person who donated Tillis Park. One of his partners was Sam Adler, whose first cousin donated Adler Planetarium in Chicago, and Sam was also the brother-in-law of Julius Baer, who was the original founder of Stix, Baer and Fuller. The third partner was Louis Sella, whose family is still very prominent in St. Louis, and Louis they met up in East St. Louis and became partners, and were quite successful.
All right, so you trace horse racing back to 1767 in St. Louis. What was the history in the rest of the country with horse racing? Was it popular everywhere?
Yes, it was very popular everywhere, and it started from almost the very beginning of the country because people would race on the open fields and do betting. And some people think that gambling only came towards the end of the 19th century, but actually gambling was part of racing from the very beginning because we didn't have the stock market, and so the way you could test your ability to foresee things would be on horse racing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know, how popular is horse racing today then, really?
It's still popular, but the popularity started going down after television came into play because people didn't grow up with seeing it on television. For some reason, the people in the sport decided they didn't want it televised. So while people would watch baseball on TV or football, they didn't watch racing as much.
You mean the people involved in horse racing decided that having it televised would not be a good idea?
Right.
That was not a good decision,
bad
was
move.
it? Yeah. I
Very
should
bad.
say so. Wow. Well, was horse racing back in the early days, was it a glamorous thing?
Well, in the early days, I think horse racing progressed much as the city did. It went from sort of a bed and breakfast type of thing for wealthier people and then became more sophisticated as the city grew. So as you see the city evolve, so did horse racing.
That's interesting. And you also, we'll talk about this a little bit later too, you sort of speculate about the future of horse racing, and I get the idea that maybe you're not sure about its future?
I am unsure. You know, they continue to have stories about horses being drugged, even though most of the racetracks are doing everything they can to prevent that type of thing. But I think anytime you have animals involved, there is more public sentiment involved. People get hurt in playing football and in baseball, but you don't hear as much of an outcry as you do when a horse gets hurt in racing.
I wonder why that is.
I think it's because the horse doesn't seemingly do it voluntarily, even though they love to race. They're bred to race.
Right.
But that's, I think, how the public perceives it.
So Making Tracks, the untold story of horse racing in St. Louis, 1767 to 1905. So horse racing started when the city was in its infancy.
Yes, it did. And the horse was very important for many reasons. It provided it was a workhorse, and it also was used in war, and we had a lot of wars early on. And so you had to make sure that you had a good horse if you wanted to be safe when you were in war.
Here's the thing that seems strange to me, and I don't know if it's strange, maybe you can clear it up a little bit. It seems odd that people would be into horse racing then as opposed to now. Now a horse is sort of an unusual thing for most people. Most people don't ever see a horse in person, right?
Right.
Except if you go to the racetrack. But if you're thinking back in the 1700s and 1800s, horses were part of everyday life. They were part of transportation. They were in the streets. They were everywhere. So it just seems a little odder to me that they would make a sport out of an everyday animal. It'd almost be like having dog races now or something. Does that make any sense?
Well, think about auto races. It's very popular simply because people know about cars. So people knew about horses, so they felt that they could test their ability to wager on a horse that they knew so well.
So betting always played a part in horse racing? It wasn't
Yes.
just to see the fastest horse. The betting money was
always
part of it from the
it.
beginning. Why don't we take a look at some of the images from your book? We'll
Sure.
start with the first one, and this is Making Tracks, the untold story of horse racing in St. Louis. And we'll take a look at that first image. It'll come up on the screen, and
Okay.
you can tell us what we're looking about. Who's
Well,
this gentleman?
that is my Uncle Cap Tillis. His real name was Andrew, but they called him Cap. And he came to St. Louis with Sam Adler, and they were involved in tobacco business, and then became involved at the Southside Racetrack, which is where McKinley is, when that baseball team there became defunct. They decided they would do racing.
Did you know this gentleman?
No. Well, yes, actually I did. I did when I was very small. I went to his country home, which is Tillis Park now, and visited him. So he was sort of the patriarch of our family.
I have a soft spot for Tillis Park because for years I lived with my grandmother on South McKnight, and I'd go jogging in Tillis Park every day.
Yeah.
That was a million years ago, so I love it there. I guess you probably visit too.
It's a great park, and I have some pictures from before it was actually a park, and it's very interesting.
So did he make a lot of money in horse racing? Was he in another line of work?
He made a lot of money in horse racing, and then he made even more money on real estate. When they sold some of the tracks, he made even greater amount of money selling that real estate, particularly in Del Mar.
Let's take a look at another image from your book,
Okay.
Making Tracks, The Untold Story of Horse Racing in St. Louis. What's this?
This is Oaklawn Racetrack, which is one of the racetracks my uncle and his partners first bought in the early 20th century, and now, of course, it's still a very fine track in Arkansas, and this is where I went to my first race.
Wow. Did you enjoy it? Tell me the truth.
I loved it, and I was in the box seats that my family had owned for generations, so it was really nice.
So there are no racing tracks in Missouri anywhere now, correct?
No, there aren't. It's now legal in Missouri, but because of the way the law is written, it's not financially feasible.
Have you looked around the entire United States? Is there horse racing in every state, or just certain parts of the country?
Not in every state, and some of them are closing because it tends. Well, some people will say it's an older crowd, but when I went, there were a lot of young people there, so I don't know if that's really quite true. But I know it's becoming harder for them to make a living at it because there's competition from casinos.
Really?
So people bet at casinos and can watch races at the casino and not go to the track.
So it's the thrill of betting money is the
That
lure?
and
it's not the love of horses?
Well, it is, but you can watch it inside at the casino and not.
Right.
So it's just what I guess you become used to doing.
You know, I lived in Louisville and Lexington, Kentucky for a while, and it was interesting to be in that horse culture and experience it, and the people sure are enthusiastic. You know, have you ever been to Louisville in Derby Week?
I've been to Louisville, but not during Derby Week.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
It
but
is.
Not all parts of the country embrace horse racing like that, do they?
No, and Kentucky, of course, is one that has, and they learned early on that it was a good thing for their economy if they did that, and so that's why it's so successful in that state.
I admit I really don't know anything about horse racing. I may have been to one or two horse races in my entire life, but I've never been to Fairmont, so I'm going to say that up front. But having been to Keeneland and Churchill Downs, it's a very, at least the times I've been there, they're very upscale affairs. I mean, you know, you could tell people had money and
Yes.
expensive clothes. I get the impression here it's a little more of an every man's kind of thing.
It is. I mean, if you go to Oaklawn, which is a very, very nice track, you're not going to see that type of dress.
All right, we're going to take a break and pick up talking more about the history of horse racing. It's an untold story. Nancy Carver is here to tell it, though, and we'll be back right after this.
Kids will spend 15 minutes watching online videos like this one.
Brushing for 2 minutes now can save your child from severe tooth pain later. 2 minutes twice a day. They have the time.
Experience St. Louis!
Steve Potter. Welcome back to City Corner. We're talking to Nancy Carver. Her book is Making Tracks, The Untold Story of Horse Racing in St. Louis, and that covers the years 1767 to 1905. And Nancy, just to recap, your family, it was a great uncle, I think you said,
Yes.
was involved in the early horse track scene in St. Louis. And how many, again, at one time, horse tracks were there here?
18.
18. Mm-hmm. Were they all the same? I mean, did they appeal to different kinds of people? You know what I mean? Were there high-end ones and low-end ones, or what was the scene?
Well, the early ones were really for more aristocratic people. And then when my uncle and his partners came on the scene, they decided they wanted to have racetracks that would appeal to middle-class people. And that's when they started what they call half-tracks. And so there were several half-tracks both in East St. Louis, the South Side Park was one. And then they could afford to build those smaller tracks and have jockeys and horses that weren't as expensive as at the other tracks. And that's when people from the middle class came.
Okay. Let's take a look at another image from your book, Making Tracks. And what have we got here?
Okay, that was, this was one of the early owners of the racetrack, and he actually, Thornton Grimsley, and he started Lafayette Park, and he was very big in the saddlery business. And I wrote about him to show that some of the early owners were ones who were involved in occupations related to racing, and that's why they really wanted to get involved in racing as well. It was good for business.
They made saddles and things like that.
Yes.
Let's look at the next one. Let's go right to the next one if we could.
And this was the amphitheater, the first racetrack that was at the old fairgrounds racetrack. And they also used it for Surrey races and to exhibit horses during the fairs that they had at the fairgrounds.
You mentioned the fairgrounds track. Now, that at least one time was the largest. What's the history in that one?
The fairgrounds track came with 3 iterations of it, and the last one was in the 90s when it became very popular. And they actually added on to the fairgrounds area in order to build that more modern racetrack, and they had a very large jockey club there.
There's an exhibit at the Missouri History Museum that ties into some of this. Could you tell me about that?
Yes, at the History Museum, and this is one of the cards from there that shows the first and second iteration of racetracks. But if you go there and you look on the walls, you can actually see a good portrayal of what the racetracks look like. So as you can see, they didn't have grandstands at the racetrack behind the circular one up here. But then when they built the modern one, that's when they came with big racetracks and a big jockey club as well.
Yeah, well, it looks like a big deal. Was it sort of like going to a Cardinals game now, do you think? I mean, thousands of people and standing in line and all that?
Oh, yes, there were. And, you know, this was also part of fairs that they had in St. Louis before the Meet Me in St. Louis fair. So it was very popular.
So did they have sort of a racetrack village, so to speak? I mean, I imagine people would come and eat and stay the day, right?
Oh yes, and then there were animals there too. So it was a place you could go not only to race, but also it was sort of the first zoo in St. Louis. They even had an elephant that raked the ground between races.
No kidding.
So they made the elephants work too.
Let's look at some more images from your book, Making Tracks.
Now this is the final iteration of the racetrack at Fairgrounds. So on the left you have the modern jockey club, which is where people dined and they played billiard, bowling. They stayed overnight, and then the wealthy people would go out and on the balconies and look at the race. And then the other people would be in the grandstands to the right.
Let's go to the next image. Are there any of the structures left anymore, or is everything gone?
Everything's gone. Can't see anything, unfortunately. But this was an image from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that is the World's Fair Derby in 1904. So during the World's Fair, they had a big race at Fairgrounds, and they had a $50,000 purse which was one of the 2 largest purses in the country at that time. A lot of money for that period of time.
And don't you call that the most famous race, I guess, in St. Louis, right?
Yes, it was. And people came from all over to see that race. So a lot of international people.
Who was Todd Sloan?
Todd Sloan, if you ever listen to the words to Yankee Doodle Dandy, Yankee Doodle went to London riding on a pony. I always wondered how a pony could get to London from the United States, but actually that was a song that was written for a play about a famous jockey named Todd Sloan who got his start in St. Louis at the Southside Racetrack. He actually came with his brother, who was a jockey there, and worked in the stables, learned how to ride, and then came back and rode in some of the other racetracks in St. Louis. So Yankee Doodle Dandy and St. Louis have a strong connection.
And I think I know that exact place where it was located. It was at Missouri and Russell, and there are just some like old apartment buildings there now.
Well, that's where McKinley High School is.
Right across the street, yeah.
Yes, right there, where McKinley High School is. That was the exact site, and that was actually a half-track. And that was the scene of the first night racing in St. Louis.
So horse racing, would it be an everyday affair? Was it just on weekends, or how did that work?
It was almost every day, actually. So it could be weekends, but then people, once they started night racing, people could come at night after work. Then people who didn't have to work could go during the day.
Let's go back and look at some more pictures from your book. Making Tracks, the untold story of horse racing in St. Louis.
Now this shows the relationship between the Del Mar Racetrack and the fairgrounds, and might be a little bit hard to see, but to the right of where it says World's Fair, you see Del Mar Gardens, which was right next to the Del Mar Racetrack. Now there is some evidence of that track because you have East Gate and West Gate, which are streets that led into the park, and where Washington University recently did some development. It's the exact site of where the racetrack used to be.
Now, isn't there a story about the famous Indian Geronimo connected with this one?
Geronimo, yes. Geronimo was told by the president to go to the World's Fair to be featured there, and he was going to be in a Wild West show there. Well, the owner of the Wild West show got into a fight with an owner of another Wild West show and killed him. Yeah. And so the fairgrounds people said, well, we don't think you should be here. Well, they had to do something with Will Rogers, who was going to be in the show, and with Geronimo, and this is Geronimo. And so they put him over in the Del Mar Racetrack, and they had the Wild West show there. So I think I can safely say that's the only racetrack that Geronimo worked in.
You know, you were talking about how when racing started in St. Louis, it was sort of an upper class thing. But I'm just wondering, you know, a lot of people look down on, like, say, casinos now and think it attracts a low-life element. I'm not saying that, but, you know, people say it.
Sure.
So there was a time, too, when that happened to horse racing, wasn't there?
Well, yes, that people got very upset about the gambling that was at the race. So you would see articles in the newspaper about the effect that gambling was having on families. And some of it was exaggerated. In fact, a number of the stories that I researched were without validity.
Really?
Yes, but they sold newspapers, so they're a great thing to write about.
Well, when did the demise of racing in St. Louis really start?
That really began in 1905 when the Governor Folk came into power. And he was elected to end corruption in the city of St. Louis. And he found that he really couldn't do that very well, so he decided, well, I'll put an end to drinking on Sunday, which wasn't something that the Irish and Germans really liked, and I'll do away with gambling at the racetracks. So he started raiding the racetracks.
But wasn't there a movement, or people really believed that it'll come back someday, but why didn't it?
It didn't come back because the laws of Missouri didn't change until the last several years. And then now the law does permit racing, but it's not something that's economically feasible because there's so many restrictions in the law. You can't do simulcast, which is a big moneymaker. And so there aren't going to be racetracks in St. Louis or the state of Missouri.
You don't see that
for
as
some
a possibility ever?
No.
Yeah.
But of course you can go to Fairmount, so that's good.
Yeah, good for them, right.
Yes.
Let's look at a few more images from your book, Making Tracks.
Okay, and this is Todd Sloan. Todd Sloan was a famous jockey that I spoke about. He invented this crouch, and so before this, jockeys would sit straight up in the saddle, and their legs would be straight down. So this was why he won so many races. He popularized this monkey crouch position.
Let's go to the next one.
And this is Todd Sloan again.
Looks a little more sophisticated there.
Very sophisticated.
And I think we have two more. Why don't we just look at those?
Okay, and this is Governor Folk, who, as I said, came into power in 1905. And, there was a lot of controversy about it because at the time, and of course until recently, the governor had more power over the police departments. And Del Mar Racetrack was in the city and the county. So the county in particular the sheriff did not want his men to be used by the governor to raid the track. And the city did. And one of the reasons I was interested in it was because my great-grandfather was a member of the mounted police that raided the park. So I had one side of the family raiding it and another side trying to protect it.
Oh, typical family, I would say.
Yes.
Right. Was he popular when he did this? I mean, was this controversial?
It was very controversial, and he never held an elected position after this.
It ruined his career.
It ruined his career. Both because of the end of horse racing and the end of drinking on Sunday.
Wow. I think we have one more image to the book. I'm not sure. Maybe we don't. If not, let's move on then.
Oh, this is
here we go.
all of the proceeds for the book, all of it goes to Therapeutic Horsemanship, which is in Wentzville, Missouri. And I thought a book about horses should benefit horses in some way. And Therapeutic Horsemanship provides equine therapy to disabled children and veterans. So it's a very good organization.
What was, we just have a few seconds left, Nancy. What was the most, as someone that didn't grow up being a horse racing fan, what was the most interesting part of this for you?
I think it was just finding all of the people in St. Louis that were involved, some very well-known names who were involved in horse racing that I never would have thought would have been involved in the sport. And to me, that was fascinating. You know,
I was looking at the research you did. It looks like you did a lot of research. So there was a lot on the books about this, was there?
Well, it was very hard to find it. Old newspapers, a lot of different old newspapers.
The name of the book is Making Tracks, The Untold Story of Horse Racing in St. Louis. Nancy Carver, thank you so much. I hope people will go to Reedy Press's website and look for you in local bookstores. It's a fascinating story. Thanks for sharing it.
Thank you for asking me to come.
I'm Steve Potter. That's it for this edition of City Corner. Thanks for watching. Join us next time. Bye.